Rotary, welcome.
Thank you very much, John, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. What I'm going to talk about is, kind of give you a sense of, where the U.S. economy is, and perhaps probably more importantly for your purposes, where we think it's going to be going over, say, the next 2 years or so. So let me just kind of cut to the chase with that, and, kind of show you where we are right now in terms of the economy, where we think it's going. So these bars show you GDP growth. It's probably the best way to measure what's kind of going on in the economy. These green bars off to the right get you out to the end of 2016. And so obviously one thing to take away from that is we don't have any negative bars in there. We don't see a recession, although I can certainly think of ways that could happen. And I'll come back at the end and kind of maybe talk about some downside risk to our forecast. The second thing to note is that these bars tend to get a little bit bigger over time. As a matter of fact, and so keep in mind this is in real terms. Economists tend to think in inflation-adjusted terms. I realize business people think in nominal terms, dollar terms, and I'll come back and talk about that in just a second. But as we look forward, we're looking for 3% GDP growth in 2015 and 3% in
2016. And to put that into perspective, if you go back and you look at, say, 1992 through 2007, that 15-year window of, quote, normal times, the average GDP growth rate was 3% a year. If we do indeed do 3% next year, 3% the following year, that would be the strongest 2-year window we've had since the middle of the last decade. Dare I say, normal times. Then put this into your perspective, you'd say, what does that mean for dollar terms? Tack on roughly a 2% inflation rate. In dollar terms, we think the economy will grow roughly 5% over the next two years. Now, you would be forgiven if you're a little bit skeptical, because people have said, I've seen this movie before over the last few years. People kind of get bulled up going into a new year, and then doesn't really, time doesn't go back into recession, but kind of is grinding along. What's different this time? There's two things that are different. The first thing is this chart right here. This is public sector purchases. Right? So when I say the public sector, people tend to think of Washington, D.C., and that's roughly 50% of the public sector. The other 50% is the state and the local governments. Okay? And at various times over, say, the last 5 years, there has been fiscal restraint. In the first 3 years or so, it was all about the state and the local governments cutting back, because as most as you can appreciate, most states have a balanced budget sort of amendment, right? And so when their revenues get crushed, like they did during the downturn, they've really got to cut back on government spending. That kind of went away in 2012 as those budgets started to stabilize, but 2013 was all about the federal level. Right? We had the sequester, and then we had the government shutdown, and those two things alone sliced off almost a full percentage point off the top line GDP growth. And as you go forward, and you look where we are right now and going forward, we no longer have that fiscal headroom. At the state and the local levels, the budgets are expanding, spending is starting to pick up. And at the federal level, the sequester has been kind of modified, pushed back. No one's going to be shutting down the government anytime soon. Okay, and so that fiscal headwind is behind us now. All right, so that's the first thing. The second thing is when maybe a little bit deeper into the economy, when you look at what's going on with consumers. Here I'm showing you this is household debt measured as a percent of disposable income. People refer to this as a measure of leverage. All right, and we all know the story how American consumers got levered up over the last 2 decades, particularly the decade of the one that just went by with the housing boom. Okay, as you can see, we've been deleveraging now for 5 years. And if you look closely at that line, you can see in the last few quarters, it appears we're hitting an inflection point. That downward slope is starting to flatten out a little bit. And so it looks like some of this deleveraging that's been going on is kind of behind us. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you all that deleveraging is done. I don't know that for sure, okay? But if this were a baseball game, where are we right now? 7th, 8th inning? And unless we go into extra innings, it's pretty much done. We've been deleveraging now for 5 years. I seriously doubt we've got another 5 more years to go. So balance sheets are looking better. Okay, and the reason why I say some of the deleveraging is, I think, getting done is you look at our next chart here. Here I'm showing you household wealth. So what is this? This would be the equity you have in your home, your stock and your bond portfolios, your savings and checking accounts. I mean, it's the whole 9 yards.
Okay? And what we're doing here is we're making two different adjustments. We're putting it into real terms, inflation-adjusted terms. Because we all know if you had $100,000 of wealth 10 years ago, it's not going to buy as much today. It's going to buy roughly 20% less. Okay? And then the other things we're doing is we're putting it into per capita terms because, you know, if it was just you and your spouse 10 years ago, 0 kids, and you have $100,000. And then today you have 2 kids, we all know that $100,000 isn't going to go as far. Right? And so what we're trying to capture here is what is kind of an individual look at in terms of their balance sheets. When you do that, you can see we're back above the previous peak. House prices have come up. Now they're not back to where they were in most parts of the country, but they're coming up. Stock market's at an all-time high. People aren't feeling as stressed about their balance sheets anymore. Okay, and I'll show you a chart here in a few minutes about the savings rate. The savings rate's starting to come down because people are starting to get a little bit more optimistic. So that's the second thing that's different. These balance sheets have been improving underneath the surface. Okay, and what that means is you go forward, we think consumer spending will remain positive and will actually start to strengthen a little bit. Now we don't think we're back to 2004 to 2007 supercharged rates of consumer spending, but if we're growing 2.5% in real terms, that's not so bad. Okay. The other things that are happening here's business fixed investment spending. So this would be business purchases of equipment, software, structures, non-residential construction would be included in here. Okay. You can see that that's been growing recently, and we think that's going to probably continue to grow in that mid-single digit sort of range. That's typically where it grows at this part of the business cycle, where I would characterize as mid-cycle right now. And you don't see a lot of business cycles, but you can see the last one, you can see this is typically where we kind of grow here. Okay, so you got consumer spending going forward, you got business fixed investment spending continuing to move forward. Here's housing starts, here's our view on housing starts. So where we are now would be that, this 2014 would be that first green-red sort of bar. History is shown by the dark bars of the Carolina blue on top of them. Okay, we can say the run rate, the underlying run rate of our economy, or should I say, the demographic run rate, will support somewhere between 1.25 and 1.5 million units. We haven't done that for 8 years. Now, arguably, we built way too many houses before the bubble blew up. But again, we have not been at the demographic run rate for 8 years. And we don't think we'll be there next year either. So there's pent-up demand for housing. And what's really strong is the multifamily space. You know, because a lot of kids don't want to have a single family house, at least not right now, or maybe they can't qualify for a mortgage. Because the mortgage market remains somewhat tight at this point. And so what are they doing? They're moving into apartments. Right? And as an economist, when I'm looking at top line GDP, I don't care if it's 5 single family homes or 5 multifamily homes. It's all part of GDP. I realize builders have they care, but in terms of the overall macro economy, it doesn't really matter where they're moving. Okay? Housing affordability remains very, very high. This is essentially an index of prices and interest rates. Prices remain low. They're coming up, but they're certainly not back to where they were in 2006 in most parts of the country. And mortgage rates are still very, very affordable if you can qualify. So housing affordability is still very, very high right now to help that. Here's what's happening in terms of employment in our economy. I'm putting this into year-over-year percent changes. That way you can compare kind of past cycles. Right now, on a year-over-year basis, employment is growing 2% a year. And that's as good as it ever got during the last term, 2003 to 2007. We're not back to the 90s yet, but it's been growing pretty strongly. As a matter of fact, if you look at the first 7 months of this year, first 8 months of the year, okay, on average, we've created about 225,000 jobs. Last year, we did 195,000, so there's been some acceleration. And if you want to say, okay, so you told me we're going to grow 3% next year. How do we grow 4 or 5%? I would say let's take a look, keep an eye on this chart. If that accelerates, if that goes to 250, 300,000 jobs per month on a sustained sort of basis, the unemployment rate, which is 6%, is going to start to drop a lot faster. People are going to start to feel a lot more confident. And one of the things that may have held the economy back in the last few years is people weren't confident that if they lost their job, they were going to find another one.
Right? This wasn't 2006. Back in 2006, if you lost your job, you cried about it for 10 minutes, and then you said, so what, I'll find another job. And 2 weeks later, you were working. So people have held back, but if the labor market really starts to accelerate here, then you start to really, I talked about pent-up demand for housing. There's other areas of pent-up demand, okay? Let me just jump to it. Here's vehicle sales, car sales. As you can see, back before the downturn, we were doing about 17 million units annualized on a consistent sort of basis. We're finally back to that level, but we've been below that level for 7 years. The average age of a car on American roads today is 12 years. Okay, now I understand that you can drive cars a lot longer than you could 20 years ago, because the quality is lower. Okay, but the point is, there's a lot of people who are still driving beaters that would like to be driving something new. And if they finally feel confident enough to go out there, because they're confident that, okay, if I lose my job, so what, I'll find another one. And they go out and they start to buy cars, and we could spike up to 18, 19, 20 million units, not on a sustained basis, but that's how you get to a supercharged sort of economy. So that's the upside potential. That's not our forecast. I'm not going to stand up here and say we think we're going to grow 4%. But if you have me back next year, and we're growing 4%, you say, what do you guys miss? I say, let's update that employment chart and see what we've done over the last 12 months. Okay? And then finally, in terms of inflation going on in the economy, there's not a lot right now. I know you've heard of CPI inflation. This is a little bit of a different concept. It's called PCE. I'm not going to bore you with the technical details. It's very similar to the CPI. The important thing here is this is what the Federal Reserve looks at, because they think this is the best measure of inflation in the economy. 2 things to point out here. The second is it's very low. It's about 1.5%. No matter how you measure it, whether you can include gasoline prices and food prices, or whether you throw them out just because they're too low. On either measure, they're growing about 1.5%. There's not a lot of inflation in the economy. But look what's happening. It's starting to come back up. A year or 2 ago, the biggest risk in terms of prices that the economy faced was a mild deflation. I mean, when you're down at 1%, you're within spitting distance of a mild deflation. That's receding. That risk is really receding. Now, we're not looking at a 1979 sort of inflation anytime soon either. But the inflation dynamics are starting to change. And what does that mean for the Federal Reserve? It means that the Federal Reserve is going to start to lift interest rates. Okay, they have an FOMC meeting that's going on today. It will wrap up tomorrow. No one's expecting them to raise rates tomorrow. But there is some expectation in the market that they may signal in their statement afterwards, rate hikes are coming. Okay, our guess is they'll start to raise rates springtime of next year. So right now, the target for the Fed funds rate, which is the the policy rate there, is between 0 and 25 basis points. It's essentially 0%. By the end of 2015, we think it's at 1%. The end of 2016, we think it's closer to 3%. Going back to normal. Right? If you just look at the long time series here, look at that blue line. You don't even have to go back to the 90s. You know that we've been abnormally low for a while. It's starting to change. Rates are going to start to come up. All right. At this point, pretty upbeat. Right? If we're right, the economy will grow the strongest in the next 2 years that it's grown in about 10 years. What could go wrong? Let's talk about the downside. All right, first of all, you have to say to yourself, so how do recessions happen? Recessions happen in 1 of 2 ways. One is when something gets out of balance in the economy and it has a big correction, like housing, or more appropriately, housing finance. A very large part of the economy had a very large correction that produces a very painful recession. That's how we got to the last one. The one before that, late 1990s, early 2000, was all about tech. Big correction, small part of the economy, small recession. What's out of balance today in the economy? Frankly, there's not a whole heck of a lot. And I could talk about the deficit. I don't even think I brought a chart of the deficit. Didn't bring a chart of the deficit. Because quite frankly, it's not much of an issue anymore. Now, I'm not going to belittle our long-term fiscal challenges. We've got some long-term fiscal challenges. But right now, the deficit as a percent of GDP is less than 3% of GDP. Economists tend not to worry about it when it's that small. And if people were worried about it, long-term interest rates would be going through the roof. Right? Nobody would be buying U.S. Treasury securities that are yielding 2.5%. if people really thought the deficit and debt were a huge problem. And so I don't worry about that. And when I look around, we don't have a housing bubble. I'm not a stock strategist, but most people say we don't have a stock market bubble right now. I look around the economy today, and I don't see a lot of things that are majorly out of balance yet. Now, I can think 5 years in the future, but that's 5 years in the future. The biggest downside risk to the U.S. economy today really come from external sources. So let's talk about three of them. China. China's slowing down. China will continue to slow down. I feel pretty confident in saying this, China will never grow 10% again on a sustained basis. As you can see, this gets us out to 2016. We were looking for below 7%. Now, below 7% still sounds like a strong growth rate. Right? By Chinese standards, that's pretty slow. All right? This is not the Chinese government is not unhappy with this. The big problem in China is this graph right here. This is showing you where growth is coming from. The Carolina blue lines or bars is the percent of growth coming from consumer spending. The dark is what comes from investment spending. You may look at that and say, well, that's great, it's balanced, 50-50. And it's not balanced at all. Most major economies, you'll be looking at least 2/3 consumer spending, less than 1/3 investment spending. There's been way too much investment in China over the years. And what's happened is, so now I'm showing you, this is debt as a percent of GDP. The US is on the left-hand side, China is on the right-hand side. The household sector would be the dark bars at the bottom. The government debt would be the green bars at the top. And then what sticks out like a sore thumb is that stuff on the right for China, that's business debt. Chinese business sector is pretty darn levered right now. Now, I don't think it's going to blow up, okay, but China's not the most transparent economy in the world. So that's something. So China's now the second largest economy in the world. If they have a debt problem there, we're going to feel it in lots of different ways. Our exports would slow down. Financial markets would have a hiccup, to put it mildly. I'm not sitting here and telling you that China's going to blow up in the next 2 years, but I don't feel as confident saying that as I would have, say, 2 years ago. So keep an eye on China. The second downside, Europe. Okay, here's the outstanding government debt in some of the European economies. The three guys at the right, Ireland, Portugal, Greece, don't worry about it. It's a manageable situation. You can bail those economies out. They've all been bailed out at least once. Okay, it's manageable. Spain and Italy, though, is not manageable. The outstanding government debt of Spain is close to €1 trillion. The outstanding government debt of Italy is over 2 trillion euros. To put that into dollar terms, that's more than 3 trillion US dollars. Nobody has that kind of money. If these governments cannot roll their debt, then they're going to restructure their debt. And probably as everyone in this room knows, when you do a restructuring, someone's going to take a capital hit somewhere. So let's say Spain has to restructure its debt. Where's the capital hits occur? So now I'm looking at balance sheets in Spain. This is the amount of Spanish government debt sitting on the balance sheets of the financial institutions in Spain. The most recent bar is about 800 billion euros. Now you're going to say, hold the phone. Didn't you just tell me there was €1 trillion worth of outstanding government debt? That's right. 80% of it is sitting in the financial institutions. That's where the capital hits come from, would happen. And this is a strong word, but I'll use it anyway. If Spain can't roll its debt and has to restructure, it will lead to the collapse of the Spanish financial system. Now, it's one thing if Greece goes down the tubes, it's quite another thing if the Spanish economy does. The Spanish economy is one of the top 15 largest economies in the world. Now, you're sitting there thinking, okay, so what? I don't have any business in Spain. I don't have any exposure to Spain. I've never been to Spain. I never want to go to Spain. Why do I care about Spain? You may not have exposure to Spain, but everybody in this room has exposure to this. This is called LIBOR. You see those two little humps there in 2010, 2011, 12? That's Greek 1 and Greece 2. Those two bailouts. And Greece is a small little thing. Spanish financial institutions go down the tubes. This is going to push out again. You want to see what it looks like when it hits the fan? You see that spike back in 2008? You know what that's called? It's Lehman Brothers. Now, I don't know if Spain is big enough to be another Lehman Brothers or not, but I don't know if I want to find out. I didn't like that movie the first time. I don't think the sequel's any better. Okay. Again, I'm not here to tell you that Europe's going to blow up, but it's a risk. And it needs a catalyst, right? You know, this thing's been around now for 2 or 3 years. People just aren't going to start to, investors just aren't going to start to throw up Spanish government bonds. You need a catalyst. What's the catalyst? The catalyst is risk number 3, is the amount of energy dependence that Western Europe has on Russia. Here I'm showing you natural gas. Okay, Germany gets 1/3 of its natural gas from Russia. France is about 1/4, or Italy is 1/4, France is a little bit less, but still huge dependence. Not only in natural gas, but I can show you the same thing for crude oil, you see the same thing. Huge dependence. Okay. Right now, it looks like the Russia-Ukraine thing's kind of on the back burner, but I'm not convinced it's fixed. It kind of comes and kind of goes. Right? And if we get into a world in which we put sanctions on them and they come back and put sanctions on us, and we've already done some of that, and this thing gets ratcheted up, their trump card is their energy dependence, and is Western Europe's energy dependence. And they could embargo their energy to Western Europe. You say, never happened. Oh yeah? Remember 1973, 1974? Okay. Now, that would, you know, a Russian energy embargo in Western Europe would put the Russian economy into a deep tailspin. Okay, and I don't think they would take that lightly. But in these kind of geopolitical sorts of spats, sometimes the economic takes a back seat. If Russia were to do that and Europe goes into a deep tailspin, and then Spain can't refinance its government debt, and then the Spanish banking system blows up. That's the catalyst, how you get there. And again, I'm not here to say that's going to happen. I'm just saying that that's a risk. Okay? So if you ignore those 3 risks, the world looks pretty good right now. Okay? And quite frankly, you know, it's those things, it's impossible for me to put a probability on that, to try to quantify those sorts of things. Okay? But, you know, in general, the US economy, there's been a lot of healing here over the last few years. Things are looking better. The next 2 years, assuming some of these risks don't materialize, should be pretty darn good, and count on the Fed to start to raise rates, which actually isn't a bad thing. The Fed's raising rates, and the economy's doing pretty well. I would be all for the Fed raising rates right now, because again, it means things are looking a little bit better. So, with that, do we have any 5 minutes or any sort of question? Anything I talked